Now we are
You
recording.
did. Okay, you did.
All righty. So we read last week of a roller coaster for King David. He
Mhm.
runs away from Saul. He seeks refuge among Israel's hereditary historic enemies, a clan of Philistines.
Right.
He's almost compelled to ride into battle against Israel. And in the last minute, which he doesn't want to do, obviously, in the last minute, the other Philistines, thankfully, insist that he go back home. They have their little village or town inside the region of the Philistines.
Mhm.
They come back home to find their city ransacked, their women and children and anyone that was left behind kidnapped.
Mhm.
They pursue them. They end up leaving a few hundred men to watch their stuff, and then 400 men pursue. And they end up being incredibly victorious, not only wiping out this evil band of folks who kidnapped their people, but they retrieve everyone and their assets. And it ends up being quite a good, quite a successful event.
Mhm.
Initially, before this victory, everyone is mad at David. They're like, oh, David, if not for you and having your crazy idea to join the Philistines, well, then we would have never had our town ransacked. But when they're victorious and they take over and they even have food to drink and eat, and they're able to be victorious and feel the thrill of victory. Well, it's a wonderful moment.
Mhm.
And just to go back a moment here, nothing of theirs was missing, young or old, son or daughter, spoils, nothing had been lost. So David took all the livestock, the stuff, it was the spoils,
Mhm.
and then they joined up with the 200 men who were too weak to join the fight. There were some troublemakers. Those troublemakers did not want to share. They said, listen, we fought. You folks stayed behind because you were too weak and tired. No problem.
Mhm.
But if you don't put your life on the line, you don't get a share of the spoils, which sounds reasonable, but that's not a way to create a cohesive, respectful society. That's a way that you create different classes.
Mhm. That's exactly right.
And so that is a problem that King David has to contend with, and he does so admirably. So you had some mean and churlish fellows, rude in a mean-spirited and surly way. Oh, Joy is joining us. Wonderful.
Yes, hello.
Joy, glad you're on. Hope you had a good class prior to this.
Yes. It's a shame. I only get half of it. But he was talking about the fact that the holiness is not reserved just for the priests, but extends to the whole community. All Jews have to be holy. So it was a very interesting lecture, but I'm devoted to you, Rabbi. So
I don't take that for granted. I'm grateful. And maybe we'll find some overlap between the two discussions. So just to give another fast read. I'm sorry?
I said, that's good. That's really good. I get something out of that, and I get something from you. So I'm very lucky in that regard.
Well, thank you. We cherish your participation and your wisdom. And so thank you for being on. So basically last week we talked of King David's vulnerable town is sacked, and whoever stayed behind, mostly the women and the children, were all kidnapped. David and his men pursue the kidnappers. They overtake them. They are victorious in a battle, and they retrieve every last individual who was kidnapped. No one was hurt. And even more than that, of course, now they have all of this additional wealth and livestock from the band of kidnappers who attack and sack their city. And now the warriors come back. And if you may recall, the people split in two. There was a smaller party of folks who stayed behind to watch the stuff and the kids and, the babysitting. And there was another group that went out to battle. And so upon returning from battle, the mean folks who joined David, not that everyone that was with David was mean, but there were some of them that were mean, said, if you guys didn't accompany us to battle, you don't get any of the spoil that we seized. But you can have your children and wives back. But besides for that, and family. We're not going to give you anything. You don't get it. So what do you do if you're David? How do you respond? On one hand, you want to encourage bravery. You want to encourage the warriors. On the other hand, you don't want to create the split in your group, and you don't want to not appreciate the folks who stay behind. The defense and offense are both essential, right? And so you don't want to create this class divide. And so David, as you may have guessed, vigorously disagrees. David spoke up and says, you must not do that. This is not the way to behave, my brothers. In view of what the Lord has granted us, guarding us, delivering us into the band that attacked us, can anyone agree with you? The share of those who remain with the baggage shall be the same as the share of those who go down to battle. They shall share alike. So the defensive units, the guards who stayed back to protect their family and their stuff, and the unit that went forth into battle must be treated equally. And this became known as the David Doctrine. So from that day on, it was made a fixed rule for Israel, continuing to the very day that this text was composed. And so here we find a very fair David, who's working now, honing his leadership qualities to preserve a degree of fairness and friendship in his unit of folks who are devoted to him. And so we're starting to find a diplomatic side to David. He was wise over here. You don't want to disenfranchise 200 of your 600 men. That's a big loss. And you need to keep everybody, engaged and cared for. And you need to be thoughtful, not just of the individuals, not only about your fiercest warriors, but about an entire society, or at least the best as possible. And then David does that. When David reaches Ziklag, which is David's city in the Philistine zone, he sent some of the spoils to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, this is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. And so David is now sharing with those who are most loyal and connected to him. And so we're finding that David is becoming quite a diplomat and learning an important, or exercising an important principle, which is you need to be gracious, you need to be magnanimous, you need to share. And that's what David's doing. He sends additional spoils to the elders.
Who did he send those shares to, Rabbi? You said he sent the spoils to...
A share of spoils to the people of the people that were loyal to him. Mostly the people of Judah.
The ones who stayed behind.
No. These are to people. Remember, David's on the run, so he's out of Israel. But he's now planning his return to Israel. And so he sends gifts to the people who he know are close to him back in Israel.
Okay,
so he sends gifts to the elders of Bethel, which is in Judea, Ramoth Negev, Jatir, Arier, Sifmoth, and Esh Demoah, and to Rachel, to the folks, the towns of the Jerahmeelites, as he calls them here, and the towns of the Canaanites, and Hormah, Borshan, Athach, Hebron. These are all places where David and his men had roamed. So David had been on the run. People had been good to him. People had been kind to him. People were friendly with him. And he's now reciprocating and acknowledging their friendship and acknowledging their alliance. And this is, of course, going to prove to be a wise move, as David, unfortunately for Saul, is very soon going to become a major nationwide national leader. Now, just give me 30 seconds and we will.
Joy,
Yes.
did you get the fourth shot?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Lynn. And you did too, I hope?
I did Monday. Yes, I did. Yeah.
I still think it's important to wear a mask when you're indoors.
I agree.
I really do. They're not following that here, but I'm still wearing the mask indoors.
Me too. Yeah.
Because this new variant is very contagious.
Right. Right.
All right, so let's take a look. So basically, this is the end of David's pre-monarchy triumph. David, again, just to recap, in an interesting turn of events, needs to seek refuge among Israel's enemies, the Philistines. He's almost schlepped into battle. He almost has to be engaged in battle against his own people. That is something David absolutely does not want to do. He's sent home, thankfully for him, by other Philistines who don't trust David to be loyal to the Philistines. And that's going to be very good news, as we'll see in a moment. And David, although his people are attacked, he's able to defend them, retrieve his people, and find great riches in the process. Magnanimously, he makes sure that all of the people on his team are treated equally, not allowing favoritism towards those who actually guarded the home front, while others entered into battle. Lastly, David sends presents to those people who he knows to be faithful to him. And that's the end of the story of David's triumph. We are now going to continue on with the 31st and final chapter in the book of Samuel 1. Now, the book of Samuel is actually divided into two books. There are two volumes, Samuel 1 and Samuel 2, otherwise known as Shmuel Aleph or Shmuel Beis, the story of the prophet Samuel and his prodigies, Saul, and then King David. I want to tell you something very funny. When we study the Bible, when we study the Torah, when we study the book of Joshua or the Judges or Samuel, we describe the division of the narrative, the division of the book as chapters, perakim, and also verses, which if you see the screen, you'll see right now, we have verse 31 of chapter 30 highlighted. I want to tell you something funny. Do you know who actually created these chapters and verses? Not the Jewish people who preserved the work of the Bible for thousands of years, but actually Christian publishers who first brought the Hebrew Bible to print.
Wow.
So ironically, there are certain parts of our traditional study of the Bible that uses division of chapters and verses as are recorded by the original publishers, printers of the Bible in the written form. Now, Jews initially didn't own printing presses when they were first developed and first invented, and they needed to depend on the whims of the printers and their publishers. And so ironically, this division is not inherently Jewish, but it pretty much became embraced by the Jewish people as a convenient resource to help cite, chapter and verse, and to identify the locations of the prayers. But once upon a time, I do not believe it was so divided. Even more so, or along the same lines, I'm fairly certain the book of Samuel didn't used to be Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. It was one book of Samuel that for the purposes of either printing or marketing was divided into two books, but for whatever reason, the names stick. And so I thought that would be an interesting trivia point to share as we are in the final chapter of Samuel 1. We're going to end that book, but we'll right away transition and continue with Samuel 2.
Rabbi, I have a question. Who wrote this? Who wrote these books? I forgot. I remember you told us, but I don't remember.
The original books were written by Samuel, meaning the earlier books. Well, they weren't written by Samuel. They were written and recorded, but they were kind of put into its final form by Samuel.
Okay.
The book of Samuel, however, is not created by Samuel, although parts of it may have been. The initial parts may have been from Samuel. I believe the latter parts of the work of Samuel, and I have to double check, so I'm saying this with a big question mark, but I believe it is attributed to the prophet. Oh, here. The Talmud notes that until chapter 25, it was written by Samuel. From then on, it's written by two prophets called Gad and Nathan, who lived during the time of King David, Saul, but a little bit afterwards, and the time of King. So these are the authors who edited or created the book were mostly folks, according to Jewish tradition, who lived through that period of time. Some of it by Saul and Samuel himself, and a bulk of it by other great prophets of his era. Prophets, by the way, who we're going to meet. A prophet called Gad and a prophet called Nathan.
So, Rabbi, nowhere does it state who wrote this. In other words, it doesn't write.
The book isn't signed, so you're not going to find the name of the author inside. There was a tradition about who was the author, and the reality is that it's a little bit of a composite.
Right, but it doesn't. It's not printed anywhere saying that. Okay.
It's not attributed within the text. So it's not like there's no verse that says these are the writings of.
No, not the particular verse, but like the whole book. Like
the book, within the book, there is no reference to its author.
Okay.
We know it was we have external clues, meaning we have other records of who the authors were, but it's not within the text itself. And so that's interesting.
So all these books that we're going through right now do not have any reference to who wrote them. Is that what you're saying?
No, the book of Moses does.
The
Bible does have a reference. Some of the other works, some of the prophets are in first person. Part of the book of...
So is the book of Moses written by Moses?
The book of Moses is written by Moses, yes.
But how about Genesis and those books?
Well, Genesis is also written by Moses. He may have not been the original author. He didn't live during the time of creation, but he...
That's right.
But he created the work, most likely, according to the Bible, at the instruction of God. And these were most likely works and stories and ideas that were within the tradition of the people that preceded, Moses.
Yeah.
And Moses is the one who transcribes it.
The five books then are all essentially written by Moses.
Yeah, that is the assertion. With divine information and inspiration. But yeah, Moses is the author.
Okay, thank you.
Now we're going to come to the story of the downfall of Saul. And I'm just going to give you a heads up. The first part, it's fine. It's an abstract description of battle. At the end, there are a few verses that are a little bit gory. And so I'm going to give you, not now, but when we get to that, I'll give you a little bit of an alert, just so, if you'd rather bleep out.
Is this the end of Samuel 1, this last?
Yes, we are in the tail end of Samuel 1. We are in the final chapter of Samuel 1.
Okay.
And if we had to give it a title, it would be The Fall of Saul. Now, we already know what's going to happen to Saul, because last week we joined Saul on a journey to an old woman who practiced outlawed sorcery and magic practices that somehow were able to summon the souls of the dead. And he communicates with his mentor, Samuel, who is already departed. Samuel is not happy to be summoned from the dead. And Samuel tells him, this is not going to end well for you. You're going to fall in battle tomorrow. And this is where we're going to come to admire that Saul's last day was an act of nobility. He could have ran, he could have escaped, he could have not faced the music, and yet he chooses to spend his last day among his people, fighting a battle he knows is doomed to fail. Tragic, but also noble. The Philistines attacked Israel, as we knew was going to happen, because they were rallying and gathering. We met those Philistines back behind on their front when they sent King David away. Remember? Same Philistines. And the men of Israel fled before the Philistines, and many fell on Mount Gilboa. So the Jewish people, the Israelites, did not have confidence, they did not have faith, and they flee. And usually, bad morale breeds more trouble. And so many times we've seen Israel's enemies flee, and Israel pursues. Well, unfortunately here, the tide is turned, and it's the Israelis or the Israelites' time to flee. The Philistines pursue Saul and his sons. This is a very sad verse. the Philistines struck down Saul's 3 sons, Jonathan, the noble Jonathan, dear friend of David, Malchishua. I'm sorry, I skipped one. Avinadav, Jonathan, Avinadav, and Malchishua, sons of Saul, all struck down.
Oh,
Painful, devastating loss for the Jewish people. The battle rages around Saul, and some of the enemy archers hit him. Excuse me. He was severely wounded by the archers. So he not only, I don't know if he realizes that his sons have died, but now he is hit.
mm-hmm.
Saul says to his arms bearer, please draw your sword through me. He's asking his assistant to take his life.
Oh,
So that the uncircumcised, he's describing in an offensive way, the Philistine enemies may not run me through and make sport of me. He knows that if he survives and the Philistines get a hold of him, they're going to treat him in a horrific, painful, torturous way. His arms bearer, in great awe, refused. His attendant is not willing to do this final act of service. Whereupon Saul grasped the sword and fell upon it. So
he
Saul
didn't-
ultimately takes his life.
Ay. All right.
A very sad, painful event.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of perceived, based on the way the story is portraying it, as not really having much of a choice. He knows he's not getting out of this event alive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sad to see the passing of someone who we've come to admire and then be a little bit perplexed by his complicated personality.
Right.
He makes mistakes, no doubt, but he was a person who did live more or less for the people of Israel, nobly, and he never sought this position. It was thrust upon him, never existed before. And so in his final moments, we can't help but have a sympathetic feeling towards this man who is now no longer among the living. And then his arms bearer, seeing his master no longer among the living, takes his life as well.
Okay. I get it. Mm-hmm.
And so on one day, Saul, his 3 sons, and his attendant are all passed on, along with all of his men, all of his inner circle. They're all gone.
Mm-hmm.
And the people of Israel see that their king, their protectors have fallen, and they all abandon their cities, and they basically abandon them, and the Philistines come and occupy these cities.
Mm-hmm.
So Israel is really in a precarious situation. They lose the battle. Their great protectors have fallen, and they cede a lot of territory to the Philistines. I'm not even going to give an exact translation, but suffice it to say, the Philistines find their remains and they treat them very, very poorly.
Mm-hmm.
They use their body and their armor as a trophy of their victory. They send it around town. And eventually Jews, Israelites, retrieve the remains of Saul and they bury him, and they are feeling very mournful. And that's the tragic way. It actually says the people who retrieve their remains, bury them under a tree, and then fast for 7 days. And this is the final chapter of Samuel 1, the first king, requested by the people, chosen by God, anointed, appointed, and mentored by Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
Just a few years after Samuel's passing, too, is no more. This is Saul, father-in-law of King David, but also jealous competitor of King David. And so just for a moment, let's think about this. David lost his father-in-law, 3 brothers-in-law
Mm-hmm.
in one day, complicated by the fact that Saul, at the end of his life, is not really very favorably inclined towards his son-in-law,
Mm-hmm.
even though David treats him with a lot of deference and respect. And this is the end of King Saul's complicated, fairly short reign, first monarch of Israel. That's the story of Saul. Now, in the beginning of Samuel 2, which we can Yeah, it's still early. We can take a sneak peek ahead at Samuel 2. I will just tell you that we're still going to talk a little bit at the beginning of Samuel 2 about what happens with his family. He has a son that survives, and what happens with King David. And so let's start chapter 1. We'll end probably a bit earlier than usual, but let's take a look at chapter 1. So after the death of Saul, which again, I told you to last week, we have this very ironic juxtaposition of Saul's downfall and King David's triumph. David is flying high. He just came from a victorious battle against an Amalekite tribe. He retrieves his people. He's laden with wealth. At the same moment where his competitor, but also Israelites, are mourning and lost. And so David is feeling triumphant. So David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, and he's there for 2 days, celebratory. The third day, a man came from Saul's camp, his clothes rent, earth on his head, and he has approached David. He flung himself to the ground and bowed low. David says to him, "Where are you coming from?" You can imagine the mournful way he says, "I just escaped the camp of Israel." "What happened?" asked David. "Tell me." And he told him how the troops had fled the battlefield. Moreover, many of the troops had fallen and died, and also that Saul and his son Jonathan, who's David's dear friend, were all dead. "How do you know?" David asked the young man who brought him the news that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. Which again, we know that one of the first reactions, of course, is denial, disbelief, and David can't believe that it's really true. And so the young man who brought the news answered, "I happened to be at Mount Gilboa. I was at the battlefield. I saw Saul leaning on his spear and the chariots and horsemen closing in on him. He looked around, saw me, and he called to me. When I responded, 'At your service.' He asked me, 'Who are you?' And I told him I was an Amalekite. Then he said to me, 'Stand over me, finish me off, for I'm in agony and I'm barely alive.'" So he's describing a story that may or may not happen, that he finished off Saul. "So I stood over him, finished him off, for I knew that he would never rise from where he's lying. Then I took the crown from his head, the armlet from his arm, and I brought them here to you, my Lord."
Oh, that was convenient.
How do you think David's going to respond?
Well, that depends, because if he wanted to accept being the king, he might be very happy that he has the crown, etc. But on the other hand, knowing David, perhaps he wouldn't respond that way.
So, Lynn, you know David well.
Yeah.
David took hold of his clothes, rent them, he tore them, and so did all the men with him. So they are not happy. They're not celebrating. They're mourning, even though realize their term on the run has come to an end. They were fugitives of King Saul. And yet their reaction is one of mourning. They lamented and wept. They fasted until evening for Saul, for Jonathan, for the soldiers of God, of the Lord, the house of Israel, who had fallen to the sword.
Well, he was very close to Jonathan also.
He was close to Jonathan.
Yeah.
Yeah. David said to the young man who had brought him the news, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I am a son of a resident alien, an Amalekite," which means he was from the tribe of Amalek, and he lives among the Jews. Now David takes out his rage, but at this young man. "How did you dare," David said, "to lift your hand to kill the Lord's anointed? I understand that Saul was dying, but what kind of messed up creature are you to be willing to take the life of Saul?" And so David acts very, what we might judge as harshly.
Oh God. No. No.
Thereupon David called one of his attendants
I
and said, "Strike him down." And David said to him, your blood is on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I put the Lord's anointed to death. So he's like, you should have never said that you killed the king. But if you are the one that killed the king, now David felt he had no choice but to
Aye.
avenge his death in that manner.
You see, loose lips sink ships.
Yeah.
You have to hold your
He
tongue.
thought he was going to be celebrated by David
Yeah,
for killing his pursuer.
yeah,
But Lynn, you know David better than the Amalekite did.
right.
And the Amalekite thought he's going to be celebrated as some kind of hero.
hmm
And unfortunately,
That wasn't the case.
that was not the case.
hmm
And David begins singing a mournful lament over Saul and his sons. And he ordered the Judites to be taught this song, the Song of the Bow, which is recorded in a work that we don't have called the Book of the Yashar, the Book of the Straight. Alternatively, David says, our king fell at a new technology, arrows, and there's an alternate reading that says he said, we need to learn this technology. We need to really master the bow. Not that Jews didn't have bows and arrows, but it doesn't seem like it was a prevalent tool in the military. And he says, basically, we got to start using these bows and arrows. At least we need to figure out how to deal with them. And so to go a little deeper, why did the Israelite soldiers panic? They panicked because the Philistines had a unit of archers. And so David is saying, if those archers could throw our men into a panic, we need to find the antidote. We need to be able to push back in the same manner.
Well, maybe they had to have shields.
Maybe they needed shields. They probably also needed to learn other
To learn
strategies.
they had to learn that technology, but the shields might have helped them. Yeah.
So basically, David is saying, although our translation here disagrees, but all the other commentaries I'm reading in Hebrew say that David really said it's time to teach the Jews the bow. We need to learn the art of warfare, including and inclusive of archery.
Yeah.
Sheila, welcome on board.
Yes, it was a little hard getting home from my doctor's appointment, but I did get home. Thank heavens. Good to be here.
We're glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here too. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Sheila. How are you?
I'm good. Everything's fine.
Good.
Have a nice Passover.
You
Good.
do?
So Sheila, I want to give you the
Yes.
30-second version of what we discussed.
Okay, thank you.
David is
Put it
very
over here.
triumphant because he was victorious in a battle against a clan that had attacked and seized some of his women and children, and they victoriously pushed back and retrieved their stuff, and more importantly, their people. Not a one is missing, and they're feeling very triumphant and victorious. There are spoils of battle, which David shares equally among all his men, and he then even sends gifts to those families and clans that were kind to him while he was on the run from King Saul. While King David is more triumphant than ever, King Saul has his worst day ever. It's his final day, and it's a day where most of the Jewish troops are panicked. They flee the battlefield, leaving the few brave men, Saul, his sons, and a few others, to be brutally slaughtered by the Philistines. David, after 2 days of triumph, discovers he gets news of the fall of Saul by a young Amalekite who witnessed his passing. The Amalekite brags to David that he himself killed the king, hoping that he'll be celebrated as a hero for getting rid of David's pursuer. And instead, David is absolutely devastated by the loss of Saul and his sons, and indignant, which is an understatement, that this Amalekite would be willing to take the life of Saul, and he strikes this young man down. And then David takes stock. Why did Israel's soldiers panic? And he realizes it had to do with a new technology that arrived on the scene in that region, which was archery. Archers. The Philistines now had a unit of archers. And David says it's time for us to learn everything there is to know about the archery about arrows, about defense and offense, so that in the future, the Israeli warriors will not panic and they will not run away. He then sings a mournful song, mourning the death of his father-in-law, his pursuer, his predecessor, and someone who David nonetheless treats as a hero of Israel. And he says poetically, your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How have your mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, Philistine city. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, Philistine city, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, but the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. O hills of Gilboa, mournfully, let there be no dew or rain on you, or bountiful fields. He curses this battlefield where Saul and his sons die, for there the shield of the warriors they rejected. The shield of Saul, polished with oil no more, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the warriors, the bow of Jonathan never turned back. The sword of Saul never withdrew empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and cherished, never parted in life or in death. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who brought you honor, who clothed you in crimson and finery, who decked your robes with jewels and gold. How have the mighty fallen? The thick of battle, Jonathan slain on your heights. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen. These weapons of war have perished. David, ever the poet. We know David's a poet, right? He composed Psalms. And so he composes this beautiful poem, this mournful song for the passing of his father-in-law, his brother-in-law, leaders of Israel. And I want to tell you something. These lines are reflected and echoed thousands of years later in many eulogies and Hebrew texts describing the passing of, and so some of these things may be familiar. It actually also is introduced into Jewish liturgy. Minisharim kalu ma'arayot gaveru, swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. And many times we also describe a person beloved and cherished, never parted in life or in death. This is a line that you'll see very frequently, composed by our poet, King David, who mournfully wails and bemoans the painful loss of Saul, his sons. A sad day, a sad song, but an important chapter in the story of the Jewish people.
Now, this is the last chapter of Samuel 1.
No, this is actually the first chapter of Samuel 2.
Okay,
So
where
as you can
he
tell-
mourns.
I'm sorry?
Yes, go ahead, please.
As you can tell, chapter 1 and 2, like I said, were originally a single work. And so it seamlessly transitions from the story of Saul's death, Jonathan's death, to David's reaction, which really can reasonably be seen as a single story. And again, for the purposes of publishing or whatever, it's divided into two, but it is essentially a single story. And that's what we just read over here. David's mourning the fall of the king, his father-in-law, and Saul and Jonathan, notwithstanding the fact that at least Saul pursued him, would have taken his life happily, and yet David doesn't feel like celebrating. David feels like mourning. And again, it's a reminder of how noble a person King David is, that even though the person that died was the person who would have killed him, David is not going to celebrate his downfall. On the contrary, David mourns the loss of a king, a protector of Israel, and even describes them as the weapon of Israel. And so even though he personally has a complicated relationship with Saul, in a very altruistic and mature way, if we can say that, he's feeling very mournful. And that's chapter 1 of our next book, Samuel 2. Chapter 2 is going to be about David's reintegration into Israel, how he slowly becomes a new leader, how they deal with the survivor of Saul's family. So there's a lot of additional complexity and other details to explore. I guess we might call it the fallout. A leader's passing creates a vacuum.
Mhm.
And even if there is another leader, there's always going to be some kind of vacuum. No two leaders are alike. And, each leader, especially here where they come from different families, there's going to be different regions that become the center of the Israeli, governance. And, a lot happens. And there are a lot of things are impacted by this event. And of course, ultimately, David establishes what becomes the Davidic line. And so David's descendants become the monarchs for the next several hundreds of years. And really over 1,000 years, if you include other political leaders who were not kings in Israel, but had political autonomy in other times in Jewish history. So we're talking about a line, a dynasty that really changes the course of Jewish history, even to the point where there are families today who trace their lineage
Oh my God.
directly back to King David. Now, it's only because if you can trace your lineage, if you have a family tree that traces back to a famous, known, historic personality who traces himself back to a famous, earlier known personality who could trace himself back to a line that was. So there are ways that certain individuals have a record of a family tree going back literally 3,000
Wow.
years. Not most people don't have that. There
Mhm.
are some few unique instances of families that can tell you that they trace all the way back to King David himself. And so this is monumental. Unfortunately, it needed to happen for the sake of the way Jewish history unfolds. But today I can't help but join David in feeling mournful for
Mhm.
the passing of Saul.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Who appoints David as king? Do the people do that? Does God do that?
So we'll see that eventually the people rally around David, but we actually already read of how in a
Right.
somewhat low-key event, Samuel already has kind of appointed David as king. No one knows about it.
Right.
And so what's going to happen now is that David kind of naturally fills a certain void. And with time, and that's what we'll discover in these coming weeks,
Mhm.
David becomes the uncontested leader of Israel. But like everything in life and like every story in the Bible, it's not smooth or seamless. There are challenges to be overcome and complex and nuanced circumstances that need to be navigated. And
Right.
that's what we'll be talking about next.
Okay.
Please God.
Yep.
And so, dear friends, I want to thank you for joining us today. We covered 3 chapters,
Mm-hmm.
the final 2 chapters of Samuel 1, the first chapter of Samuel 2. Today it's kind of easy to recap. Chapter 30 was in Samuel 1, David's victory and generosity to make sure all of his men are equal, or I shouldn't even say all of his men, all of his warriors, all of his combatants, all of his people are cared for.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but he then acknowledges those who are gracious to him. He's
Right.
thoughtful and appreciative. And then we have chapter 31, Saul's fall, a tragic, painful story. And then chapter 1 of Samuel 2, which is King David's response to the news,
Right.
and a beautiful poem, a mournful poem, which again, as we pointed out, is reflected, studied, and adopted even to this very day.
Well, there's a lot to be said for David,
Yeah.
don't you think?
Yeah,
He was very compassionate, empathic. So
Now, I
and-
do want to acknowledge as we close that David, like everyone in the Bible, is complicated. People are complicated.
Mhm.
And so the Bible is not going to make the case that David was not complicated. David
Right.
was also a person that has different experiences and triumphs and failures, including some very famous episodes that we'll encounter
Right.
in due time.
We all do, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, let's close out today's discussion with this. And I want to thank you all for being here. I look forward to these weekly discussions.
Mhm. We
And
do too.
And let's be in touch.
Okay,
Okay, Ralph.
Sheila, welcome home. I hope everything
thank
goes
you.
smooth and easy and dry.
Well, at the point, I could move forward. I can't get a hold of the report, but I'll go down today once some more. I can't, it's so hard to get a report, and that's what I need to move forward. But
Right.
I am fine, thank you for your help, and we're working on it.
All right.
But I'm
Very
not
good.
that-
Well, good.
It's really funny that I'm not really upset about it for some reason. I don't know why. I guess there's more important things that can be worse, right? So,
What is this
and
you-
all in all,
What is this?
I came home from my for Passover, and there was a leak last 10 days leaking in my closet from my air
Aye.
conditioning. So I have wood floors, my closet and, my outside my closet, how much is warped is questionable. My problem is, if I could get a hold of the report, then I could manage with things, but I'm working on it, but the good news is I have insurance, so hopefully that will kick in. So I'm not going to complain about anything.
Fantastic.
Hashem is good.
It happens.
Leave it at that, right? Thank
All right,
you.
everyone. Have a
Take care,
good
everybody.